On the Good Life. On the Good Life. Michael Grant et al. Audio by Paper to Audio. Extracts. pp. 184 to 192. Extract ends as a shining light of goodness and excellence. pp. 194 to 199. In that case, my dear friends, severe for the followers as the leaders. pp. 217 to 222. Perversely, from the authentic, the better and more decently it has behaved in life, the easier this road will be. That was also Scipio's opinion. A conversation he took part in only a very few days before his death seemed to show a presentiment of what was about to happen to him. Phyllis was there, and Manilius and a number of others, and you and I, Scaevola, had gone together to join them. For 3 days Scipio spoke about the condition of our country, and then near the very end of his discourse he turned to the immortality of the soul, repeating what, as he declared, the elder had told him in a dream. If it is true that, when the best men die, their souls have a special opportunity to escape from the imprisoning confinement of the flesh, it would be impossible to think of anyone whose journey to heaven can have been easier than Scipio's. To utter lamentations, then, because of his death, would seem to me a proof of envy rather than friendship. If, on the other hand, the soul perishes at the same time as the body, and all sensation ceases to exist, then while it is true that there is nothing good in death, it is equally evident that it can have no bad results either. For if sensation has been lost, a man is exactly as if he had never been born, though the fact that Scipio was born brings us joy, and will never cease to bring joy to this land of ours as long as it remains in existence. And so I say once again that all has gone very well with him, but less well with myself. I entered life before he did, and it would have been more appropriate for me to depart from it first as well. Yet so happy are my recollections of our friendship that I feel convinced my life has been a good one, because I have spent it with Scipio. Both in our public and private lives he and I have shared all the same interests. We lived in the same home, we soldiered together in the field. Our tastes and aims and views were identical, and that is where the essence of a friendship must always lie. As for my reputation for wisdom, which Fannius just mentioned, it is quite undeserved, and in any case it satisfies me less than the hope that my friendship with Scipio will go down to posterity. This is a hope which I cherish all the more keenly because, throughout the whole course of history, the pairs of friends who have been lastingly remembered only amount to barely 3 or 4 at the very most. It is my greatest desire that future generations will add the friendship of Scipio and Laelius to this small number. FANNIUS, that is a hope, Laelius, which will be fulfilled, there is no doubt about that. But you touched just now on the question of what friendship really means. Since we are free of public business at the moment, I am going to ask you to do me a favor, and I know I am speaking for Scaevola as well. When people seek your views, whatever the topic may be, they always find you most obligingly ready to answer their queries. Now will you please speak about friendship in the same way? Tell us how you would define it, and let us know the principles you consider it involves. Scaevola, yes, do please talk to us on this subject. If you will, I shall be quite as delighted as Fannius. Indeed, when he asked you, I was just about to make the same request myself, so you would be doing us both a very great favor. Laelius, I should be willing enough to do as you say if I felt in the slightest degree confident of saying anything worthwhile. The subject certainly is a splendid one, and as Fannius remarked, we have the spare time. But who am I to do such a thing, and what are my qualifications? The people who offer discourses of this kind tend to be scholars, and Greeks at that, speakers who claim the ability to deal with any subject you care to set before them without the slightest preparation. But that is a formidable thing to attempt and needs a lot of practice. So if you want a comprehensive discussion about friendship, I advise you to apply not to me but to the men who make a profession of such speeches. All I myself can do is to urge you to place friendship above every other human concern that can be imagined. Nothing else in the whole world is so completely in harmony with nature, and nothing so utterly right, in prosperity and adversity alike. But one point I particularly want to make is this. Friendship is only possible between good men. I do not propose to go into this aspect too meticulously, like the people who argue at length that no one is good unless he is wise. That is all very subtle and may well be logically correct, but it possesses little relevance as a practical guide to living. Moreover, even if we concede that the people who put forward this view are right, the wisdom they have in mind is something which no mortal man has ever achieved. What you and I want to do, on the other hand, is not to look at such purely theoretical, imaginative aims, but at the actual possibilities of everyday life. Our ancestors admitted Gaius Fabricius, Manius Curius, and Titus Coruncanius into the category of wise men. But one could not claim that even they were wise by any such perfectionist standard as that. So much then for the name of wise man. It is an invidious and confusing definition anyway. The philosophers can keep it. All we shall ask them to concede is that those early Romans were good men. But even this they will refuse to admit because of their insistence that no one can be good unless he is wise. All we ourselves can do, therefore, is to get on as best we can, with the aid of our own dull wits. So let us take some individual whose life and behavior have displayed proven loyalty, honesty, fairness, and generosity, a man of unflinching integrity, like those whose names I just mentioned, someone whose character does not contain a trace of covetousness or violence or unscrupulousness. for such are the men who are generally described as good. And we are obliged to agree that they are entitled to the designation. They deserve it because, insofar as human beings can, they are acting in accordance with nature, which is the best possible guide to right living. For nature itself, I believe, was the creator of the ties that exist between one person and another. The closer the relationship, the more powerful the ties. Thus they are stronger between fellow citizens than between foreigners, stronger among relatives than among strangers. It is true that even between people who are foreign and strange to one another, nature encourages the development of a friendly feeling, but in such cases the sentiment lacks a solid basis. Real friendship is even more potent than kinship, for the latter may exist without goodwill, whereas friendship can do no such thing. You can see its unique power when you consider this point. The bonds which nature has established to link one member of the human race with another are innumerable, but friendship not only surpasses them all but is something so choice and selective that its manifestations are normally restricted to two persons and two persons only, or at most extremely few. Friendship may be defined as a complete identity of feeling about all things in heaven and earth, an identity which is strengthened by mutual goodwill and affection. With the single exception of wisdom, I am inclined to regard it as the greatest of all the gifts the gods have bestowed upon mankind. Some people I know give preference to riches or good health or power or public honors, and many rank sensuous pleasures highest of all. But feelings of that kind are something which any animal can experience, and the other items in that list too are thoroughly transient and uncertain. They do not hang on our own decisions at all, but are entirely at the mercy of fickle chance. Another school of thought believes that the supreme blessing is moral goodness, and this is the right view. Moreover, this is the quality to which friendship owes its entire origin and character. Without goodness, it cannot even exist. Let us follow the procedure we adopted before, and define goodness according to the usage of our daily life and speech. All those ideal measurements and grandiose phrases, which certain philosophers like to produce, can be left on one side altogether. If men are generally regarded as good, let us accept them as such, Paulus and Cato and Gallus and the younger Scipio and Phyllis and people like that. For all ordinary purposes they amply meet the case. But as to those other hypothetical personages who are not to be found anywhere in the world, we shall be well advised to forget all about them. Among individuals of the kind we are considering, the benefits that friendship offers almost defy description. They are so great. To begin with, how can life be worth living at all, to use the term of Aeneas, unless it reposes on the mutual goodwill of friends? It is the most satisfying experience in the world to have someone you can speak to as freely as your own self about any and every subject upon earth. If things are going well, you cannot possibly enjoy your prosperity to the full unless you have another person whose pleasure equals your own. Should things go wrong, your misfortunes will indeed be hard to bear without someone who suffers as badly as yourself, or even worse. And so friendship is quite different from all the other things in the world on which we are accustomed to set our hearts. For each and every one of those other objectives is specifically adapted to some single purpose: riches to be spent, power to secure obedience, public office to win praise, pleasure to enjoy oneself, good health to be free from pain and make full use of one's bodily endowments. Friendship, on the other hand, serves a great host of different purposes all at the same time. In whatever direction you turn, it still remains yours. No barrier can shut it out. It can never be untimely, it can never be in the way. We need friendship all the time, just as much as we need the proverbial prime necessities of life, fire and water. I am not speaking of ordinary commonplace friendships, delightful and valuable though they can be. What I have in mind instead is the authentic, truly admirable sort of relationship, the sort that was embodied in those rare pairs of famous friends. Friendship then both adds a brighter glow to prosperity and relieves adversity by dividing and sharing the burden. And another of its very many and remarkable advantages is this: it is unique because of the bright rays of hope it projects into the future. It never allows the spirit to falter or fall. When a man thinks of a true friend, he is looking at himself in the mirror. Even when a friend is absent, he is present all the same. However poor he is rich. However weak, he is strong. And may I attempt to convey an even more difficult concept? Even when he is dead, he is still alive. He is alive because his friends still cherish him and remember him and long for him. This means that there is happiness even in his death. He ennobles the existences of those who are left behind. Take away the bond of kindly feeling from the world, and no house or city can stand. Even the fields will no longer be cultivated. If that sounds an exaggeration, consider the converse situation. Note the disasters that come from dissension and enmity. When there is internal hatred and division, no home or country in the world is strong enough to avoid destruction. That shows the value of the opposite situation, friendship. A certain learned man of Agrigentum is said to have composed an inspired Greek poem in which he sang that all things in nature and the universe, whether stationary or moving, are united by friendship, and discord is what pulls them apart. Here, at least, is something said by a philosopher which no one can fail to appreciate and approve. That is why, when an instance arises of someone incurring or sharing danger on behalf of a friend, the act is welcomed by the rest of the world with superlative praise. For example, when my guest and friend Marcus Pacuvius produced his recent play, one incident earned loud applause from the entire audience. This was the scene in which the king was confronted by two men and did not know which of them was Orestes. Pylades claimed that he was Orestes, in order that he should be the one to be put to death in the place of his friend. The real Orestes, however, continued to insist on his own true identity. The entire crowd stood and cheered, although it was only a play. You can imagine how they would have felt if it had happened in real life. Here, then, was a case of nature asserting its power. People were applauding in others what they had not been given an opportunity to achieve for themselves. Well, that is what I have to tell you about my views on friendship. If more remains to be said, and I have no doubt that it does, you had better ask the people who are used to conducting this sort of discussion. FANNIUS, no, you're the person we want to ask. I have often had occasion to interrogate the professionals you mention, and it was pleasant enough to hear what they have to say. But your approach to the subject is quite different from theirs and wholly distinctive. SCVOLA, you would stress that point even more, Fannius, if you had been at Scipio's country house the other day when they were discussing state affairs. Laelius spoke magnificently in defense of the idea of justice, while Phyllis produced elaborate arguments to the contrary. FANNIUS, Laelius cannot have found it very difficult to stand up for justice, since no one displays the quality better than himself. SCVOLA, yes, and that means he ought to find it easy to speak in favor of friendship as well, since that, too, is something he has put into practice with outstanding loyalty, perseverance, and fairness, and we all know the great admiration he has earned by so doing. LAELIUS, this really is coercion. Your tactful choice of weapons does not change the situation at all. Whatever may be said about your methods, they are violent, and when one's sons-in-law really press one for something, especially in a worthwhile cause, it is by no means easy to resist them. Indeed, I suppose one ought not to try. I have thought a lot about friendship, and the more I think about it, the stronger my feeling is that the important question one has to decide is this. Does the fact that people need friendship mean there is some weakness and deficiency in themselves? If so, this would mean that their main purpose in acquiring friends is to exchange services with another person, that is to say, to give and receive benefits which it would be beyond their own individual powers to grant or obtain on their own account. But surely this giving and receiving constitutes merely one feature and consequence of friendship. As for its origins, do these not, Rauer, lie in something altogether more primeval and noble, something emanating more directly from the actual processes of nature? For goodwill is established by love, quite independently of any calculation of profit, and it is from love amor that the word for friendship amicitia is derived. It is true that you do often find people extracting advantages from someone by pretending they are his friends. The reason they are courting him so deferentially is because they are after some immediate benefit. But when there is real friendship, no element of falsity or pretense can possibly enter into the matter. Friendship simply cannot help being genuine and sincere all through, and that is why one is obliged to conclude that it must be a product of nature rather than of any deficiency. It cannot under any circumstances be derived from any calculation of potential profit. It comes from a feeling of affection, an inclination of the heart. The nature of this feeling can be deduced from the behavior of certain types of animal. These, it is easy to see, love their offspring up to a certain age and are loved by them in return. In the case of human beings, the same process is far more evident still. It is demonstrated by the mutual love existing between parents and their children, which nothing except the most outrageous crimes can possibly destroy. And the same sort of affection sometimes arises when we find a person whose habits and character attract us so much that we look upon him as a shining light of goodness and excellence. Goodness exercises an altogether exceptional appeal and incentive towards the establishment of affection. People who possess this quality can inspire love in us even if we have never set eyes on them. When we think of Gaius Fabricius and Manius Curius, the hearts of all of us grow warm, although they lived long before our time. Equally, everyone detests Tarquinius Superbus and Spurius Cassius and Spurius Maelius. And then there were the two individuals against whom we fought for the supremacy of Italy, Pyrrhus and Hannibal. Towards the former we do not feel particularly hostile, since he was a good man. The latter, on the other hand, will always be hated by Romans because of his cruelty. Goodness, then, is such a powerful thing that we love it even in people we have never seen, and more remarkable still, even in those who have been our enemies in war. Since that is the situation, it is scarcely surprising that our spirits are stirred when we believe we discern virtue and excellence in people who are really available friendship. The fact that it has been founded on the processes of nature and does not rely on human defects will make it all the sounder and more genuine. If advantage were what kept friendships together, the removal of that advantage would mean that the friendship itself would cease to exist. But since, instead, nature is the originator, and since nature is everlasting, authentic friendship is permanent too. That then is what I think about how friendships come into being. Do you want to make any comments? FANNIUS. No, Laelius, do please go on. And since Scaevola is younger than myself, I am entitled to speak for him as well, and so on both our accounts I ask you to continue. Scavola. Fannius is quite right, Laelius. Please let us hear everything else you have to say to us. Laelius. In that case, my dear friends, I shall tell you the points that used to come up on the numerous occasions when I was discussing this subject with Scipio. He maintained that it was the most difficult thing in the world for a friendship to last until the very end of life. Either it ceases to be mutually advantageous or people's political views change and affect their relations with one another. And another thing that changes, he added, is a person's character. It gets altered by the blows of misfortune or the increasing burdens of age. He illustrated this point by comparing what happens to people in the early years of their lives. When boys discard the dress of childhood, at the same time they often throw off their friendships, however strong these may have been before. Or else, even if they manage to maintain these associations into early manhood, they frequently break them off at that point, because the two youths then find themselves competing for a wife or some other acquisition, which can only go to one or the other partner but cannot go to both at the same time. Indeed, even if their friendship does succeed in lasting longer, it is likely to be ruined as soon as rivalry for public office begins. Among the majority of the population, on the other hand, friendship's worst destroyer is greed for money. But in men at the top, competitive ambition for jobs and distinctions is what causes the deadliest enmities, even between those who have been the most intimate friends hitherto. Scipio also expressed the view that many friendships are violently, and often quite rightly, broken when one party has asked the other to do something that is wrong, perhaps to help him gratify his vices, or to take part in some other equally deplorable act. When the demand, however justifiably, is rejected, the person who has been rebuffed claims that the laws of friendship have been flouted, and those other individuals who would be prepared to ask anything of a friend take the opportunity to hint that even if they themselves are fortunate, this is only a sign that they would be prepared to do anything whatsoever for a friend's sake. The recriminations which go on and on after an incident of this kind are very often apt to put a stop to friendships, and indeed they produce lasting enmities. Such, said Scipio, are the varied and perilous fates which hang over the relations between friends. To avoid every one of them requires the greatest wisdom and a good deal of luck as well. Evidently, then, it is necessary to consider just how far a man ought to be ready to go on behalf of his friend. If Coriolanus, for example, had friends, was it their duty to stay at his side even when he took up arms against his own country? Or should the friends of Spurius Cassius or Malleus have supported them in their attempts to become tyrants of Rome? As for Tiberius Gracchus, when he was disrupting the government, we saw how Quintus Tubero and other friends of his own age completely abandoned him. On the other hand, Gaius Blasius of Cumae, who enjoyed the hospitality of your family Scaevola, came to me to plead for leniency. I was an advisor of the consuls Linas and Rupilius. He justified this request on the grounds of his devotion to Tiberius Gracchus. He himself thought so highly of Gracchus, said Blasius, that he felt obliged to do whatever his friend required. Even, I asked, if Gracchus had told you to set fire to the Capitol, he would never have wanted any such thing, but if he had wanted it, I should have obeyed. What an abominable thing to say, and heaven knows Blasius acted in accordance with his professions, and even worse. Not content with merely following Gracchus's outrageous schemes, he actually directed them. He was not just his comrade but took the lead in the whole frenzied enterprise. And when this lunacy resulted in the establishment of a court of inquiry, Blasius took fright and fled to the province of Asia, where he joined the enemies of our country, and paid a heavy and richly deserved penalty for the crimes he had committed against the Roman state. One to claim, then, that one did wrong for the sake of a friend is no excuse. After all, what had originally brought the two of you together was a mutual belief in each other's goodness. So if subsequently you stop being good, it is hard to see how the friendship can continue. If we decided it was right either to grant our friends everything they wanted or to extract from them everything we wanted ourselves, this could only be harmless if we were persons of supreme and flawless wisdom. But the friends I now have in mind are the ones whom we ourselves actually see before our eyes and come across, or whom we at least know from hearsay. Men, that is to say, who belong to the realities of everyday life. For after all, those are the people we are obliged to take our models from. Perfect wisdom, of course, they have not attained, though we are entitled to select those who approach that ideal most closely. Thus we see, for example, or rather we have learnt from our fathers, that Aemilius Pappus enjoyed a great friendship with Gaius Fabricius, that they were twice colleagues in the consulship, and that they served together as censors. Manius Curius and Tiberius Coruncanius, too, according to tradition, were very closely associated, not only with the two I have just mentioned, but with each other as well. Now when we think of men of that sort of caliber, it is surely quite impossible for us to suspect that any of them could possibly have asked a friend for anything conflicting with his honor, or with an oath he had taken, or with the interests of the nation. And if they themselves had received such demands, to suggest in the case of persons like these that the demands would have met with refusal, is so obvious as not to be worth mentioning. For they were all men of the utmost integrity, who would have regarded it as equally wrong to have granted such a request if they had received it, or to have made the request themselves. Tiberius Gracchus, on the other hand, does not come into this category. He was perfectly well able to find people prepared to pursue his designs, men such as Gaius Carbo and Gaius Cato. And his own brother Gaius Gracchus, too, although he was by no means enthusiastic at the time, has become a fanatical supporter of the same policy now. So this is the rule we must lay down between friends: do not ask for anything that is wrong, and if you are asked for such a thing, turn the application down. To excuse oneself for committing a misdemeanor on the grounds that it was done for the sake of a friend is entirely unacceptable. Such an excuse is no justification for any offense whatever, and least of all for offenses against our country. For as both of you, Fannius and Scaevola, are well aware, our present situation requires us to keep the sharpest lookout for national crises that may be impending. The political traditions established by former generations of Romans have already been deflected quite strongly off their track and course. Tiberius Gracchus tried to give himself the power of a king. In fact, for a few months he was virtually king. The people of Rome had never heard or seen anything like it before. Moreover, even after he was dead, his friends and relatives continued along the path on which he had led the way. What they did to Publius Scipio it brings tears to my eyes even to mention. As for Carbo, we have put up with him as best we can because, after all, his leader Tiberius Gracchus got his punishment, and not so long ago. But what is to be expected when Gaius Gracchus becomes tribune in his turn, I should not care to forecast. The trouble seeps down further every day, and once this sort of deterioration has started, it gains momentum rapidly, and soon there is a headlong rush to disaster. You can see how the decisions about the ballot taken even before the Gracchian disturbances ever began, first the Gabinian Law, and then 2 years later the Cassian Law, have had their ruinous consequences. As I see it, the Assembly is now broken completely with the Senate, and major policy is settled by the whim of the masses. What we shall find before long is that more people understand how to become agitators than understand how to stop them. The relevance of these happenings to our present discussion is this: no one goes in for such activities unless he has found associates. So every right-thinking man has to get this into his mind. If inadvertently by any chance he should have contrived to involve himself in friendships of such an extremely perilous nature, he must under no circumstances let that debar him from abandoning any of these friends, once the man in question has committed some treasonable offense. Wrongdoers have to be punished, and the punishment will be just as severe for the followers as the leaders. Let Themistocles be an object lesson. He was the most famous and powerful man in the whole of Greece, and by leading his fellow countrymen in the Persian War he had saved them all from slavery. Subsequently, however, he became unpopular and was driven into exile. He should have endured what his ungrateful compatriots were doing to him, unfair though it was, but that he refused to do. Instead, he acted as Coriolanus had acted here at Rome 20 years earlier. Both these individuals rose against their own compatriots. They were unable, however, to find anyone to help them, and so each in turn took his own life. An alliance with malefactors, which is what Themistocles and Coriolanus had become, could not be excused by any plea of friendship. On the contrary, such an association has to be penalized with the greatest severity, so that no one may be misguided enough to imagine that he would be right to support a friend who is making war upon his own country. And yet, the way matters are going now at Rome, I am very much afraid that this is just the sort of thing which is likely to happen here once again one of these days. Already at this very moment the existing state of the Republic fills me with the deepest anxiety, but I also feel just as anxious, terribly anxious, about its fortunes in the future when I am dead and gone. So among the rules of friendship this ought to come first of all. Never ask your friends for anything that is not right, and never do anything for them yourself unless it is right. But then do it without even waiting to be asked. Always be ready to help, never hang back. Offer advice, too, willingly and without hesitation, just as you is just the sort of feeling that has to be transferred to friendship. There is no other way to find a real friend. Birds and fishes and the beasts of the field, tame and wild, every living being loves itself. The feeling is inborn in every creature. And inborn, too, is the need to find other creatures of the same species on which they can fasten themselves. The urge that impels them to do so bears some resemblance to human love, and indeed human nature engenders the same pair of feelings with a special degree of intensity. For they too love themselves, and they too search for a partner whose personality they can unite so utterly with their own that the two are almost transformed into one. Perversely, not to say shamelessly, most people want to have the sort of friend they cannot be themselves. They expect their friends to provide what they themselves are incapable of supplying. However, the ideal requirement for such a relationship, next to being a good man yourself, is quite the opposite. It is to find someone not different from oneself but the same. That is the best guarantee of the permanence I have been discussing. And those two are the circumstances in which men united by mutual sympathy can learn to master the passions to which other men are slaves. They will take pleasure in fairness and justice. There is nothing they will not do for one another. They will be incapable of asking their partner for anything that is not right and good. And besides loving and cherishing each other, they will also feel mutual respect. Remove respect from friendship, and you have taken away the most splendid ornament it possesses. People who believe friendship gives a good opportunity for all sorts of laxity and crime are making a dangerous mistake. That is not why nature gave us this blessing. She did not give it in order to pander to our vices, but to help us behave decently. For the highest standards of behavior are impossible to realize on one's own. Union with someone else, companionship, are the only things that can ensure them. Such an association, whether you're speaking of today, or of the past, or of any epoch in the future, ranks as the finest and most glorious of all possible connections, embodying the highest good that nature has to offer. For friendships of such a kind embrace everything worth pursuing by mankind, goodness and fame and peace of mind and satisfaction, the things which make life happy when we have them, whereas without them there can be no question of happiness at all. This happiness is the summit of our best ambitions, but if we are to get it, we shall have to concentrate on raising our behavior to the very highest standard that morality can achieve. If we fail to do this, we can achieve neither friendship nor, for that matter, any other worthwhile objective. Anyone who ignores these standards but imagines that he has friends all the same, will discover his mistake as soon as some serious emergency obliges him to put their friendship to the test. Consequently, my warning needs to be repeated again and again. Become devoted to your friend only after you have tried him out. Do not first become devoted and then try him out. There is nothing which causes people to display worse carelessness and pay graver penalties than their selection and acquisition of friends. We are apt to plan, too late, for something that is already in the past. We start doing what has already been done, just the thing that the old proverb tells us to avoid. And then very often after we have become involved with someone by meeting them every day or doing each other good turns, all at once, right in the middle of our friendship, some cause of offense arises and we break the whole thing off. Negligence of this magnitude, in so utterly vital a matter, is singularly deplorable. For after all, the only thing in the whole of human life which everyone without exception agrees to be worthwhile is friendship. Even moral goodness is disparaged by a lot of people who call it self-advertisement and display. And quite a number of people look down on riches because they themselves happen to need very little, and are content with meager food and a modest way of life. Or then again, if you consider the attractions of an important political career, although some men, it is true, are consumed with such ambitions, a lot of others contemptuously regard it as something utterly empty and futile. The same applies to anything else you like to mention. Whatever it may be, its admirers will be matched by many others who think nothing of it at all. Yet friendship is something which inspires the same opinion in everybody: politicians, scholars who devote themselves to study and learning, businessmen who stick to their own affairs and keep out of public life. Even those individuals who devote themselves entirely to the pleasures of the flesh feel the same. All these categories of person, if they feel the slightest aspirations towards a decent human existence, believe that without friendship, life does not deserve the name. Somehow or other friendship inserts itself into all our existences. However we choose to live, there is no escaping it. Picture someone who is by nature so savage and forbidding that he shuns and detests the company of his fellow men. Tradition tells us that there once lived just such an individual at Athens called Timon, and yet even that sort of character would not be able to resist making contact with some other person, for at least he could not help wanting to find a target for his venomous bitterness. You can appreciate what I mean if you imagine the following situation. Suppose that some divine being lifted us out of the crowded human society in which we live, and planted us in some spot where nobody lived at all. Suppose, furthermore, that he supplied us with an abundance of every material provision which we could conceivably require, but made it utterly impossible for us to look upon any other human being. To put up with life on those terms would be beyond anyone's powers, even if you were made of iron. If you're lonely, every pleasure loses its savor. There was a famous saying which some sage always had on his lips, Archidas of Tarentum. I think it was too I have heard it repeated by old men at Rome, and they in turn had heard it from their seniors. The saying went like this: if a man ascended into heaven and gazed upon the whole workings of the universe and the beauty of the stars, the marvelous sight would give him no joy if he had to keep it to himself. And yet, if only there had been someone to describe the spectacle to, it would have filled him with delight. Nature abhors solitude and always demands that everything should have some support to rely upon. For any human being, the best support of all is a good friend. Nature provides many a sign to let us know what she wants and seeks and demands. And yet somehow or other we turn a deaf ear and fail to listen to her warnings. The maintenance of a friendship is a varied and complex process, offering many perilous opportunities for suspicion and offense. If a man is wise, he will sometimes contrive to avoid these unpleasant occurrences and will sometimes manage to make light of them. At other times, he just has to put up with them. Indeed, if we are going to preserve the value and sincerity of a friendship, there is one such cause of offense that has simply got to be endured. That is to say, you are under an obligation not only to advise your friend frequently but to rebuke him if necessary. And when this is done to yourself and done in a spirit of goodwill, you must take it in good part. Unfortunately, however, there's also a good deal of truth in what my friend Terence said in his Woman of Andros. Flattery gets us friends, but truth earns ill will. Certainly, truth of that kind can be very disagreeable, since it does indeed produce ill will, and ill will is what poisons friendships. But flattery is in fact much the more tiresome disadvantage of the two, because while it indulges a friend's misdeeds, it is also contributing to his ruin. And most culpable of all is the friend who spurns the truth and allows flattery to seduce him into doing wrong. This whole matter requires rational and discreet handling. Advice must not be harsh or criticism offensive. If we are going to flatter, to use Terence's word, let it be just a form of courtesy, entirely free of any servile elements, since servility is what aids and abets every sort of viciousness and is unworthy not only of a friend but of any free man at all. Life with a friend is not like life with a tyrant. A man whose ears are so completely closed to the truth that he cannot even hear it from a friend is a hopeless case. Cato spoke shrewdly, as so often, when he remarked, "In some ways our worst enemies do us greater services than our friends who seem so agreeable, since enemies often tell us the truth, whereas friends never do." Certainly, it is irrational, if you're criticized, not to feel annoyed when you hear something that warrants annoyance, but to feel furious about a remark which ought not to upset you at all. You are annoyed not because you have done wrong, but because you are blamed for it, whereas what you ought to be feeling sorry about is the wrong you have done, and when it is corrected you ought to be glad. So it is an essential feature of genuine friendship both to offer advice and to receive it. The advice should be given frankly but not harshly, and received with patience and no trace of resentment. There can be no worse blot on a friendship than fawning sycophancy and adulation. Call this by whatever name you like, it can only be branded as a vice, characteristic of unreliable, insincere men who like to speak in a fashion calculated to give pleasure without the slightest regard for the truth. Hypocrisy is bound to be vicious because it saps and contaminates our standards of truthfulness. And this makes it wholly incompatible with friendship, which must be truthful if it is to have any meaning at all. The significance of friendship is that it unites human hearts, but this cannot happen if one of the personalities involved fails to remain consistently the same, and instead takes on a variety of shifting and changeable forms. For it is impossible to imagine anything more devious and tortuous than an individual who is prepared to transform his own personality in obedience not only to someone else's feelings and opinions, but even to the very expression on the other person's face.
He says no and I say no. He says yes, and I say yes. In other words, I have made it my duty to agree with him in everything one.
That is Terence again, but now he is speaking in the character of Gnatho, the sort of friend whom nobody but a fool would want. There are a great many people about who, even if they are Gnatho's superiors in position and wealth and reputation, behave exactly like him all the same. And when you have a man who is not only insincere but influential, this sycophancy becomes really dangerous. However, if you're careful, it is possible to tell a hypocritical friend from a real one. You can keep the two sorts apart in the same way as you can distinguish any other sham or fake from the authentic original. A public meeting consists of wholly inexperienced people, and yet when gathered together, they can usually tell the difference between a demagogue, that is to say a politician of the smooth-tongued unreliable sort, and a statesman who is reliable and truthful and honest. A short time ago Gaius Papirius Carbo insinuated himself into the favor of the assembly by proposing a law to make tribunes of the people eligible for re-election to a second term of office. I spoke against him. But never mind about me, it is Scipio I want to talk about. Heavens, what an impressive, imposing speech he made. You might have thought he was head of the whole Roman state, not just one private citizen among many. However, you were both there listening to him, and in any case his speech is available for all to read. As a result of his words, the bill in question, which was meant to please the people, was turned down. The people themselves turned it down. To return to myself, you must remember, when Scipio's brother Quintus Fabius Maximus and Lucius Hostilius Mancinus were consuls, how popular Gaius Crassus's bill about priestly appointments seemed likely to be. Such appointments had previously been arranged by co-optation, and it was now proposed to transfer them, together with all the immense patronage they. You have reached the end of the document.